Let's get started. So good morning, everyone. And for our friends and colleagues based in Central Asia or in Europe, good afternoon or good evening. Welcome to the Central Asia Program seminars. My name is Sébastien Pérouse. I'm a research professor working with the Central Asia Program at the Institute for European, Russian, and Eurasian Studies at George Washington University. So in our seminar today, we are going to address the referendum which was held in Kazakhstan on June 5th on whether to approve more than 50 amendments to the country's constitution. And according to the official results, about 77% of voters approve the changes, which, according to President Tokayev, will transform Kazakhstan from a super presidential system to a presidential system with a strong parliament. This constitutional change also includes many other reforms, such as the reestablishment of the Constitutional Court, some decentralization with, for example, direct elections of village hakims. So, I mean, I guess our panelists will give us much more details, but also an essential goal of this seminar is to address whether this constitutional change will bring the political reset that President Tokayev is promising, or whether it will end up being little more than a smokescreen for continued authoritarian rule. So to do that, to talk about that, we have today four excellent panelists, Mr. Roman Vassilenko, Joanna Lillis, Assem Zhapisheva, and Aigerim Teleuchanova. I would like to thank our four panelists for being with us today. I would also like to add that you probably know that one of the goals of our Central Asia program is to give everyone a voice, to allow contradictory opinions. This includes, of course, giving a right of response to government representatives, and this is exactly what we have today. So I would particularly like to thank Mr. Vassilenko, who is Deputy Foreign Minister of the Republic of Kazakhstan, who agreed to be with us today despite his, as you can imagine, extremely busy schedule. So each speaker is going to present about 7 minutes. Their presentations will be followed by a Q&A session. So please feel free to send your question in the chat box. So, and as I said, we are going to start with Mr. Roman Vassilenko, who is the Deputy Foreign Minister of the Republic of Kazakhstan. Mr. Minister, the floor is yours. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, dear Monsieur Pérouse. Bonjour, good morning to everybody, and good evening to our friends in Kazakhstan. Thank you very much for this invitation to attend this very important discussion. I look indeed forward to having a constructive discussion on what I believe to be indeed one of the most momentous periods in Kazakhstan's modern history. The referendum last Sunday was a demonstration of what a new and fair Kazakhstan represents and will represent, hopefully, in the future. The country's commitment to democratic principles and an increased role for citizens in state decision-making. I believe a high voter turnout of 68% indicates that the proposed amendments to the constitution really struck a chord with the majority of the people. It is also pleasing to note that the referendum was held at a high organizational level, as noted by international observers, and there were 10 international organizations and all in all 272 international observers. Voting and counting procedures were followed, and the transparency of the process was indeed ensured. And while all of today's speakers are familiar, and I guess many of our viewers may be familiar with the approved amendments to the Constitution, allow me, for the benefit of the viewers, to very briefly outline some of the key reforms which are being implemented to address the socio-economic and civic needs of Kazakhstan citizens and to ensure the prosperity of the country. Amendments have now been made to 33 articles that make up more than a third of the Constitution, And by the way, yesterday, the amendments officially went into force. So we are now living under the new constitution as of yesterday. And the fact that the amendments were made to 1/3 of the constitution is an indication of how far-reaching the proposed reforms were and are. In addition to the quantity, the contents of the reforms is also important. Changes indeed include reducing the powers of the presidency with the aim of establishing a presidential republic with an influential parliament and an accountable government. The president will no longer be a member of any political party and will no longer have the authority to overrule the acts of local leaders. The president's immediate family members will be barred from holding political posts and top managerial positions in quasi-public companies. As you rightly noted, Mr. Peyrus, the Constitutional Court will be re-established to safeguard the Constitution and check the powers of the presidency. The amendments will decentralize Kazakhstan's political structures by transferring power from the presidency to the parliament and ensure broader input in decision-making. In addition, through a law to be adopted before the end of the year, barriers to the formation of new political parties will be lowered, which will enable political diversity and an enhanced multi-party system. Essentially, our country is embarking on an unprecedented route of democratization, modernization, and decentralization. The reforms are significant because they will enhance checks and balances, strengthen the parliament and the independence of governors and mayors, and create a legal basis to tackle corruption and nepotism. As President Tokayev noted, the following day after the referendum, the system of relations between the state and society will change, with the protection of human rights and the strengthening of national security being key priorities for our country. In addition to the re-establishment of the Constitutional Court, the death penalty will be completely banned, and a constitutional mandate will be given to the Commissioner for Human Rights. Of course, this is not the end of the road for us. I guess it will be rightly called the beginning and the birth of the new Kazakhstan only now. As you all know, the tragic events in January were a major shock and a major test for Kazakhstan, and relevant lessons were learned and are being learned. Notably, the president said on Sunday actually, during the referendum, that the referendum will ensure that the unrest like the ones we see in January would not be repeated. And while the investigation into exactly what happened is still ongoing, the president previously acknowledged that our citizens had genuine socio-political and socio-economic grievances. In this regard, our leadership has begun the process of ending monopolization, oligopolies, and making the economic rules of the game fair for all. The end goal is to create a self-sufficient middle class and an efficient economy that ensures a fair distribution of income, the creation of quality jobs, and a steady rise in living standards, as well as the full self-realization of all citizens. As the president mentioned in his address on Monday, we will continue systematic work to completely modernize and debureaucratize the state apparatus and build an advanced state that meets the expectations and demands of the whole society. Significantly, the president also emphasized that we need to review the legislation that contributed to the concentration of the country's economic resources in the hands of a very small group of individuals and provided them with excessive preferences. In this regard, an interdepartmental commission on the return of funds illegally withdrawn from the country and the return of illegally privatized assets to state ownership has been established under the Prosecutor General. Of course, I'm aware and I know that some believe these political and economic reforms do not go far enough. And I'd like to make a couple of points on this. First, as the president has noted in his address on Monday, the amendments are not the final stage, but only the beginning of our reforms. We will continue to comprehensively modernize the country And the president will present proposals on further development of Kazakhstan in his address to the parliament at the opening of the parliament's next session in September. But this will be done in addition to 20 laws on political reforms that the parliament will need to review before the end of the year. Secondly, it is imperative to implement the reforms at a steady pace. And what we indeed need is not a revolution, but evolution of the country's political processes and governance. And due to our geographical and historical background, as well as the challenging geopolitical situation in the world today, overhauling our political system too rapidly is not advisable, as this could actually undermine our efforts and potentially lead to destabilization. Therefore, we are of the opinion that it is important to transform our political system at a good speed, but without capsizing our state. Here, I should note that 4 packages of political reforms have already been implemented since President Tokayev's election in 2019, actually exactly 3 years ago today. The most recent constitutional amendments are a logical continuation of the previous initiatives, and of course they went much further than perhaps the president was intending, and the January unrest, of course, had an impact on the scope and the depth of the reforms proposed by the president. But overall, the general trend and trajectory of Kazakhstan are clear: democratization, political plurality, expanded citizen involvement in governance, and further protection of human rights. Perhaps not quite everyone is convinced at this stage, and I would I would understand why. But I believe the country's continuous reforms will in time demonstrate to absolutely everybody that Kazakhstan has truly entered a new stage of development, and a new chapter in the history of independent Kazakhstan has just now begun. I thank you, and I look forward to participating in discussion and answering as many questions as I can. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister, for your presentation, explaining indeed the goals of the government. So now we're going to have our next speaker will be Joanna Lillis. Joanna is an Almaty-based journalist and the author of the book Dark Shadows: Inside the Secret World of Kazakhstan. Joanna, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you to our host, the Central Asia program today. I'd just like to dwell on 3 points while I'm talking. One is the content of the reforms, which Deputy Foreign Minister Vassilenko has presented comprehensively, but I'd like to say a few more words about those. Another point I'd like to just talk about is about political plurality that the Deputy Foreign Minister said is being fostered in the new Kazakhstan. And finally, I'd like to say some words about the violence in January that's come to be known as Bloody January, and how that is going to play out, or the repercussions of that might play out in the new Kazakhstan. So on the content of the reforms, President Tokayev says that he's curbing the powers of the president in order to create a system with much greater checks and balances, which is something that Kazakhstan, the old Kazakhstan, if you like, has really lacked for 30 years. I mean, we've seen steady amassing of more and more powers by former President Nursultan Nazarbayev. However, what I would say about that is that the actual curbing of the president's powers are not so significant when you look at the text of the amendments. I mean, the president still retains the powers to appoint all the key officials in the state, really, from political and security apparatus, the prime minister, the head of the central bank, many, many more, and also to veto laws. And there are many other powers that the president will retain under the new constitution. It is worth stressing the point that the deputy foreign minister made about the president's power to strike down decisions by local governors being an important kind of ceding of some powers. But it's worth pointing out that at this point, those governors and mayors are the ones in large towns, cities, and regions remain presidential appointees, or at least they are chosen by local councils that are loyal to the government on the president's candidacies proposed by the president. Now, one of the demands put forward by the protesters in January was the right to elect their local officials, and that's not something that President Tokayev has basically conceded in this round of reforms. It was a very important demand. It's something we've been hearing in Kazakhstan for a very long time, that without that, there's no accountability, that people's local leaders are serving up the chain to the people who appoint them rather than down the chain. President Tokayev's only concession there has been to say that the president will have to present at least 2 candidates in future, but that did not satisfy the demands of the protesters in January. One of the, of course, we all know now that the famous slogan of the protesters and of protest previously has been Shalket in Kazakh, meaning old man go, which refers to Nazarbayev. Now, one of the changes in the constitution, I think Deputy Foreign Minister didn't mention, is the removal of Nursultan Nazarbayev and his special mentions and his powers and privileges, which were enshrined in the constitution, giving him many, many personal powers, political and also personal privileges. The removal of those, I think, does actually satisfy the demand of the protesters to a great degree. And I think it's important for Kazakhstan on a legal footing to move forward, not having one man being very special, making Nursultan Nazarbayev a mere mortal like everybody else, can start to put people on a more equal footing. So I think we can say that that demand probably was satisfied. A few changes to parliament, including the removal of a quota from the body that represents ethnic groups, or it's transferred to the Senate anyway, so Kazakhstan will have a fully elected parliament. But nothing in the constitution really tells us how parliament will be strengthened. Now, as the Deputy Foreign Minister said, laws will be enacted over the course of this year, and one of the key laws that we're talking about is one that to reduce barriers to the formation of political parties. Namely, President Tokayev has said reducing the number of signatures that you need to support your bid and the number of founder members to support the bid. Now, we have actually not only heard this promise before, but we have seen President Tokayev enact similar reductions. And still, over all these years, no new parties have been formed in Kazakhstan for many, many years. This time round, President Tokayev is indicating that he's absolutely serious about new parties being formed. But I think the key question now that we should be looking at is, will genuine opposition finally be allowed to organize in Kazakhstan? And will it be able to fight elections? Will it be able to win seats if the voters vote for it? I think this is what we need to look at. It's going to be about implementation. There's already rumors, even one MP yesterday talking about the possibility of early elections. Now, that's nowhere near confirmed and certainly hasn't been spoken about by President Tokayev. But if there are early elections, will parties be able to form in time to organize? And also, are the parties going to be sort of astroturfing the government kind of top down, pretending to create parties from the grassroots which are actually government backed? All the ones that, many of the ones that we're seeing, and certainly the ones whose documents have already been accepted by the Justice Ministry, have close links to sort of ruling circles. Some are former members of the ruling party, and so on. So, and what we are seeing as well is that already one opposition party that's linked to the fugitive oligarch and Mukhtar Ablyazov had its paperwork rejected, as in not accepted for consideration. So we really need to think about the new Kazakhstan and whether it's open to plurality, and we'll see as the months go by. We'll see how that plays out. And finally, my final point: how can Kazakhstan move into the future without justice over bloody January, in which 230 people died? Now, President Tokayev has talked about accountability, has talked about how justice will be done, and so on. But after all these months, you know, people are still in a legal limbo. Few cases have reached the courts. Torture victims are complaining that their cases are, the investigations into their cases are dragging, and we have no answers yet. I understand, as Mr. Vassilenko said, that the investigation continues, but as yet we have no answers into who perpetrated these acts and who was really behind them. And I think you know, people do need answers. Without any kind of reckoning with the past, I think it's going to be hard for Kazakhstan to move into the future. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Joanna. So our next speaker now will be Assem Zhapisheva. Assem is a journalist and political activist from Kazakhstan, and she's also the co-founder of masa.media and the founder of Til Kespek Joq. Assem, thank you very much for being with us today, and the floor is yours.
Good morning and good evening. Thanks so much for inviting me. I don't want to repeat what Joanna just said because I totally agree with most of the things she said. I just want to make one thing. I want to add one thing and make it very clear that these new amendments, they do not change the super presidential form of government in any way. I don't want to get into details, but let me just give you one example. For instance, among all these 65 changes that we have, there is this Article 44, which is, I think, is one of the most important ones. So this Article 44 stated all the powers that Nazarbayev had, and Tokayev has all the same powers now after this referendum happened. So we had not just a super presidential republic, but Nazarbayev used to have real superpowers. And sitting president Kassym-Jomart Tokayev has the same amount of powers now. So according to new constitution, he still appoints the government, he still appoints the heads of all of the agencies, head of the CES, the chair of the constitutional courts, he nominates all the candidates for the Senate speaker. And deputies nominate and elect only the chair of the lower house of the parliament. So why to have this referendum now? That's the main question, I think, is here. So there are two main reasons. First of all is to legitimize Tokayev's powers. After this bloody January happened, or January events, how we call it in our press, Tokayev needed to legitimize his own powers and to reinstate himself as a president. So that was the first reason, I think. And the second reason was to prepare and to test how the public is, ready to re-elect Tokayev the next time. So those were the main two reasons. As for referendum, I want to also state that referendum wasn't fair, wasn't it was far from free and fair. We will be hearing from independent observers all of the details very soon. But so far, if we see what happened during the election day and all of the violations that happened and all of the numbers that were given by independent observers, and all of the numbers that were given by the government, they are not the same. For instance, they say that some 68% of the citizens participated in the referendum, whereas independent observers give us 34%. So, in here we can see that this referendum shouldn't have happened if this was fair and free referendum. As I said, I don't want to repeat everything Joanna just said because I agree with that, and I think that this referendum is definitely not the shifting from super presidential republic or from the authoritarian republic, as they say. And I want to also add that despite Tokayev's claims that he wants an independent parliament or independent parties to come and join the parliament, we've seen over the years, and it's happening still, that all of the independent politicians, all of the politicians who want to create a party, they are under so much pressure. For instance, Rambulat Mamai, who is just who's been under arrest for 3 months now, and he's now facing a trial and might end up in jail for 10 more years. So that's very disturbing for Kazakhstan's democracy and for the future of our democracy. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Assem. Thank you. Our next speaker will be Aigerim Teleuchanova, who is an independent journalist and researcher from Kazakhstan. She's also a former adjunct lecturer at KIMEP University and an ex-digital editor with Radio Free Europe, Radio Liberty's Kazakh service. Aigerim, so the floor is yours.
Thank you very much for having me. Good morning, good evening, good day to everyone. Going straight to the point, I wanted to say that the referendum that happened on Sunday was something that I expected. It was probably organized as I was expected as well, given that we have seen a number of reports from independent observers and human rights organizations about the violations. To me, it seems that as a general trade, as the government always says, is not radical, very slow pace, and I don't know where it will lead. It's still hard to say right now, but I agree with previous speakers that this referendum does not democratize Kazakhstan to a significant level, because if we just look at the timings and the design of the whole referendum and the intent of the government to just have this top-down, you agree or not to these changes, there's just one question. I think that people were not just given enough time to understand what's going on. And also we have, I would say, traumatized society from January events, and many people still cannot get justice done in their families. Some lost their loved ones, some were injured, tortured, and we have seen that the system that is responsible for justice is not still working well to bring this justice to the society. And to me, the referendum and other legislative things are probably needed to the government to legitimize some things. But I think it's what is most important is to understand how the relationship between the government and society is going to be built over the next few years. Because the society, I would say, either do not trust the government or some are with the government. We have very fractured society and there is not unity in many levels. And I think that it's important to implement certain policies that actually build the relationship with trust and with some form of understanding. With regards to geopolitical situation, that's an important remark, I would say, by Mr. Vassilenko, because we are all aware of the current geopolitical situation. But I have heard this statement for many years from the government that we are in this geopolitical location where we have this and this neighbors, and it means that we cannot do this or these things. But other countries, I don't know, like Mongolia, they're also in certain geopolitical situation, but they have been pushing certain policies. So I'm not sure how this argument would be valid in the future and how it actually affects the democratization process. Because without the proper democratization process in the country, I think that there won't be proper investments, trust into the country's future and resources as well. So I think the government really needs to think how not to look good on the international arena, but first to its own people, and to build that trust again with the society and with the people, and actually includes everyone's opinion, not just certain ones that they agree with. That's it, I think, from my side.
Thank you very much, Aigerim. So, I mean, as you heard there, by what was said by Joanna, Assem, and Aigerim, this referendum and its impact, of course, raises a lot of questions, raises criticism, raises doubts. So I'm gonna give a few minutes now to Mr. Minister, maybe to answer some of these criticisms, and then we'll move on to the Q&A discussion.
Thank you very much. Yes, I listened with great interest to the comments by our distinguished panelists, and I'd like to make a few comments, and we'll be more than happy to continue this conversation later. About the referendum first, I noticed that almost 7 million people voted in favor, while 1.5 million people, 18%, voted against. So I think that that shows that there was a wide, it wasn't a unanimous vote, and 1.5 million people actually chose to come to the voting booth and vote against, expressing their opinion, even though they could have easily stayed away, but they chose to come and vote. And I think this also shows the strength of the passions that surround this issue. But the overwhelming majority of the population did vote for the amendments, and the more than 2/3 of the people did come and vote in the referendum, except for one place, and that's Almaty. And both Aigerim and both Assem, they live in Almaty, I presume. And indeed, in Almaty, according to official figures, the number was just slightly above 30% who showed up to participate in the referendum. Of those people, vote 60%, more than 60% voted for the referendum. That's also lower than the national average. What this means to me is that, of course, perhaps passions run high in Almaty. Perhaps Almaty is the most hedonistic city in Kazakhstan, or there are perhaps a variety of reasons for why there was such a low turnout in Almaty, but it's consistent. It's not just in this referendum. It has been in the past 2 or 3 election cycles. I think it's important to underline why President Tokayev went with the referendum. The law, the constitution, allowed him to simply go with the procedure of passing these amendments through parliament. It was his choice to put this package of reforms as one package for the people to consider and to vote on. And it is the president's prerogative to put issues on the referendum agenda for the people to either vote yes or no. Now, another issue is that few people knew or understood the amendments. The amendments and the proposals to introduce all of these amendments, except the ones that refer to the status of the first president, they were made public by Tokayev in his State of the Nation address in mid-March. And we're now almost in mid-June. So there were more than 2 months that have passed since the general thrust of the reforms were announced. And then, of course, these were in the public knowledge. I also would like to note a few things about how the parliament will be strengthened. To my mind, I think one of the most vivid examples is the fact that the Supreme Audit Chamber will be established that will report to the Majlis, which will be the directly elected lower house of parliament, which will be based on a proportional and majoritarian system, where 70% will be elected through the party lists and 30%, including independents, will be able to stand and get elected for these 30% of the seats. So this Supreme Audit Chamber will audit the state budget and report twice a year to the Majlis, meaning to the members of parliament, similar to the system that you have in Congress in the United States. Let me say a few words about January. Of course, it's a huge tragedy for our country, and Joanna is absolutely right in saying that this page has not been turned yet, and the investigation is still ongoing. And the president has made it's clear his commitment to see through the investigation to the very end, including into the allegations of torture. There have been more than 300 cases, criminal cases, launched into the allegations of torture, and they are being all investigated by the Prosecutor General's office to avoid any complicity of other law enforcement officers who may have been participating in this, as we call it, the illegal means of obtaining information. But the president called it for what it is, torture. And this is still the process that is ongoing. And I think that it is important that society is holding the government accountable and the media keeps asking questions. But I would like to say that the Prosecutor General's office and the Ministry of Interior, they hold regular briefings and they explain the process. And it's an extremely complicated process of investigating what really happened, who actually was complicit in killing whom, etc., etc. So it's as you can imagine, it was several days of chaos, which were ended only with the introduction of the curfew and what the state of emergency, as well as the decisive actions by the president. I guess I will stop here. I will be happy to respond to any further questions that they may have. I see some in the chat, so I don't want to monopolize the airwaves.
Thank you very much, Mr. Minister. So yes, we indeed receive a lot of comments, a lot of questions. So I'm trying to collect them. So maybe a first question based on the comments I've seen, which would be not on the substance, but on the form of this referendum. That is to say, on the conduct of the referendum itself. Well, Kazakhstan does not have a record of free and fair elections. I mean, previous elections have been systematically criticized by the OSCE, including the most recent presidential elections in 2019. So what about this referendum? Were there some irregularities, including, for example, ballot stuffing, or is, for example, the 68% turnout credible? So what would you say about that?
Me?
Anyone.
Well, if I can monopolize the airways for 1 second. The OSCE observers were here. They sent a smaller mission than usual, and that mission is in Kazakhstan as of today still. They were observing the elections. They will present their report in due time, and I guess we will see from their report what they found in terms of the observance of the laws. But I will also add that the irregularities, of course, there were, and the Central Referendum Commission took action on particular a very high-profile case when there were cases of ballot stuffing in one Almaty precinct, and according to the decision of the Central Referendum Commission, all the results from that particular precincts were invalidated.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Anyone wants to answer that?
If I may.
Sure, of course, Assem.
So I'm in direct contact with two of the largest independent observers of the groups, and I would say that this referendum was, in terms of violations, was pretty much the same as all the elections we had in the past. And I would say that for Mr. Vassilenko, he mentioned Almaty, and with Almaty is different. May I remind you that Almaty was the center of January protests. So people in Almaty are highly political and more educated, I would say. So it's much harder to crunch the numbers in Almaty. And on referendum day and yesterday and day before that, I personally received a lot of evidence from people who worked at the polling stations in Almaty, from people who went on voting. And what happened was that government, people who worked for government, all the teachers, all the students, basically everyone who had any connection to government, all the universities, they had to go and vote yes, and they had to take a picture of the ballot saying to prove that they went and voted yes. So it's the same as all the past elections, I would say. And as for referendum, I just wanted to add one more thing, that Mr. Vassilenko pointed that there were we had 2 months to learn about amendments, to discuss those amendments, but these amendments were actually published just a month, just 4 weeks before the referendum. So we didn't actually have any time to mainly to understand for ourselves what's going to change. And there were no I didn't see any campaigns that would explain all the pros and cons of this referendum. There were just advertisements of the referendum. And one more thing is that this referendum was publicized, was advertised as an answer for people's demand on January, but no suggestions from people who went on the streets, from other parties, from human rights activists, from political activists. No suggestions were collected. All of those amendments, all of these decisions were made in groups, and those groups, we don't know who were in those groups. We don't know their names. We don't know their expertise. We don't know what were the basis for their decisions to change this and that. So basically, this referendum was publicized as an answer for people's demands, but it wasn't like that. And mainly, they used Nazarbayev as a scarecrow. So mainly, all the PR regarding referendum was around Nazarbayev's name, that we won't have Nazarbayev as a Yelbasi in our constitution, on all of those things. So I would say yes. The only reason why Almaty has shown low attendance was because it's much harder to crunch the numbers in Almaty. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So let's move to another point which I see in many comments actually, is that, one of the points which is particularly criticized is that part of the population considers that these reforms were hastily, very quickly written by the government without substantial discussion with the population, which has regenerated a feeling of frustration, and I see that in the comments. So could you tell us a little bit more on this? Were these reforms essentially written, let's say, by a small circle in the presidential administration, or if not, with which social partners these reforms have been discussed and written, or who participated actually in the working group created by President Tokayev in March? And also, another question which is close to that one, were there any direct efforts made, such as educational campaign, discussion with citizens, or resources provided to help people understand these reforms? So
I should take the floor?
Yeah, you can, of course, Mr. Minister. Yeah, sure.
Oh, thank you. Well, there was, of course, a lot of educational campaign events taking place, and I think Ms. Zhapisheva contradicted herself a little bit just now by saying that there was no campaign explaining, but then at the same time, she was explaining how the amendments regarding the status of Mr. Nazarbayev was explained. I would say that I saw the advertisement for the referendum, the explanation of the referendum, the reforms put forward for the referendum, coming out from every single iron, as we say in Russian, not just the radio set or TV set, but if you really live in Kazakhstan, you couldn't have missed this educational campaign. That's one thing. Second thing, about Almaty, and I will take, I think many people in Kazakhstan would take an issue with your words, Ms. Zhapisheva, that people in Almaty are more political and more educated than the rest of the country. I don't think people in Shymkent, where I come from, would particularly like that, or say in Uralsk. I agree with you that people in Almaty are more political, they are more active in discussing the changes that need to be taken place in our country. But when it comes to actually exercising their democratic rights, they have been for many, many years rather voting with their feet, but instead of going and voting in the booth. And I hope that this will change with the time, as people realize that these reforms that are being implemented by President Tokayev, they do have meaning. He does really mean what he wants to do with the country, to transform it into a country that is indeed built for every citizen, not just for the privileged few. In terms of the who put together these amendments, it was a group of several dozen legal experts in the presidential administration, in the legal sphere, in the civil society. And as I said earlier, it is the president's prerogative, according to the constitution, to put any issue on the ballot for the referendum, which he used this time. And again, I would also highlight the fact that in campaigning for the presidency in 2019, it was Tokayev who said that all major decisions relating to the affairs of the state will be put forward for the referendum. And this referendum was the first such manifestation of his, and he basically, President Tokayev, making true on his promises. I also saw on TV on election night at about 8 p.m. or something, just after the voting closed at the Astana Theater, precinct number 115. A reporter, not a reporter, an observer from MISK, Молодежная информационная служба Kazakhstan, the information service, Youth Information Service of Kazakhstan, which is, I guess, one of the independent observer groups that Ms. Zhapisheva is referring to. And this observer simply said that he did not see any single violation. It was live on TV. It wasn't edited or something. And I was pleasantly, not surprised, but I was pleased to hear this coming from an organization that is supposed to be critical. So in terms of all these violations, which I think, and I think that they could be, but all of them need to be taken through the legal channels. The courts will review the allegations, and Ms. Zhapisheva mentions that these reports of violations will come out in short notice, in short time. I remember previous election campaigns and independent observers, and of whom there are thousands in Kazakhstan, they would be all over the social media by now with all these violations. I frankly don't see this. I was looking for this to see if there were mass violations, and so far I have not seen it. But again, if there are legal ways to seek redress.
Thank you, Mr. Minister. Assem, would you like to answer anything? Or I see that Joanna wants to, yeah, okay, please go ahead, and then I'll give the floor to Joanna.
Yeah, I just want to quickly correct myself. I meant that there are more politically educated people just because we have more journalists based in Almaty and more universities, more students. That was what I meant. And secondly, regarding your last comment on social media, my feed is full of those violations. So I think it's just algorithms. So I will give the word to Joanna.
Joanna, yes, please go ahead.
I just wanted to make a very quick point, which is that a visible campaign does not equal a meaningful campaign. I certainly saw there's a lot of billboards up around Almaty, telling people to get out and vote, really, and also a lot of them show a tick. So I think the clue is in there how you should vote. But it, you know, as in meaningful campaign, I'm not going to say that the presidential administration didn't try to some degree to explain the changes. I mean, Yelan Karin, president's right-hand man, was charged with kind of getting the word out there. But I think it's notable. We should really note that he himself said that the layman is just not going to grasp all these changes, some of them being very kind of nitty gritty and kind of obscure to the layman. And he himself said the layman won't grasp all this and really should vote with an eye on the bigger picture. Now, as for public inclusion, President Tokayev talking about getting the public involved in politics, that's not a way to involve the public in politics. And I'd also say as well that I think what Assem said about holding up Nursultan Nazarbayev as a kind of scarecrow is valid, because you know, there was a big focus on that, because obviously the president's team knew that that would be pretty popular. Because everyone's made it quite clear over many years now. So that was in the kind of easy pickings. Look, we can change this. And I will say as well that at polling stations on Sunday, most of the people I spoke to didn't know what they were voting for and couldn't explain what they'd voted for. But they did. There were some people who were pretty enthusiastic about. All they could say was we voted for change. And then there were other people who were very kind of shrugging their shoulders. But certainly nobody came out with anything very meaningful about what it was that they were being asked to vote on. Thanks.
Thank you. Another important point which I see regularly mentioned in the comments is, will this referendum and this constitutional changes lead to real social reforms, which were actually the core of the demands of the population during the events of January? So, or put another way, to what extent do these reforms meet the social expectations of the populations?
Can I maybe answer that?
Sure, sure, absolutely,
I think it's very difficult. I think it's very difficult to actually judge some of the things that will change as a result of the changes to the constitution. And I think that's one of the problems with it, you know, I think President Tokayev is probably a bit of a political geek, and he hopes that some of the tweaks he's making in local governance and so on will improve people's social positions, but socio-economic positions as well. But I think it's very hard to see how that will play out. And it's also because some of these things are, I'm not going to say minor, they're not minor, but they really are, people can't really work out how that could be their lives. And it's going to be very hard to measure how much of this changes people's lives, including, for example, improving local governance. I think a lot of the things that President Tokayev is promising about changing the sort of socio-economic position that they was one of the big problems in January, or not in January, it's one of the big problems for a long time. That people were talking about in January. I think one of the big problems there is it's going to require these enormous changes to how the economy actually works. I mean, President Tokayev has said that himself, and he's made it sound like, well, we'll just do this, we'll remove nepotism, we'll do de-oligopolization, or whatever the word was that he used. But I think he's set up a commission to try and return stolen assets from abroad and so on. But all of this is enormously complicated, and as is improving, making the economy more able, especially when we've seen some limited attempts to tackle vested interests and oligarchy. Certain businesses of Nazarbayev's family sort of dismantled or removed from them. But we're seeing this going, the administration is kind of going about this in rather a selective manner, probably because it's such an enormous job, perhaps also but just kind of dismantle the economy and kind of, there's a risk that if you sort of, go quickly, then, banks could collapse or other things could happen. The oil sector very dominated as well. But what to go back to the question, I think it's a very big job, and it's not going to be solved by those constitutional reforms. And it's also, it's going to be something that's going to play out for a long time. But I think also people are impatient, and they're impatient for their own personal socio-economic positions to improve, and they're impatient to get at their political voice. And so I think that's a challenge for President Tokayev as it goes on. And especially when people see this selectivity in how which members of the Nazarbayev family find their businesses gone and which don't, and the lack of transparency in that process of de-Nazarbayevification is kind of alarming to some people.
Thank you. We have only 5 minutes left, so let me maybe move to another point, which is on justice. To what extent does the restoration of the Constitutional Court change the situation of the judicial system. I mean, we've seen international reports mentioning that the judiciary remains dependent on the executive. For example, the president continues to pick the chairperson of key courts at the central and regional level. So can we expect real changes regarding the judiciary?
Could I, at the risk of dominating the airwaves, could I just say that this is something that President Tokayev himself is talking about? In fact, he said only a couple of days ago, he talked about that. He said there was no place for police abuse, incompetent prosecutors, and biased judges in the new Kazakhstan. Well, I mean, let's hope so. But I think what we've been seeing in terms of the investigations, the conduct of some of these investigations involving so many hundreds of ordinary people who find themselves facing quite serious charges, which could see them facing long prison sentences. We're seeing, a lot of problems in terms of how these people are being treated by the courts and by the criminal justice, not just the courts, but the criminal justice system. And there is, there is a question about whether this faulty and biased criminal justice system that has been built up over all these years is even fit for purpose. That's the question I'm asking myself. To illustrate it, I think I would just point to the fact that when last week a group were shot and then dragged from their hospital beds in January, then tortured, and they're now facing criminal charges. When a few of them went to the prosecutor's office last week, demand answers about their torture complaints and also their cases, one of them found himself slung into jail for 15 days. So, I think I probably haven't answered the question about the judiciary, but I've probably just raised some perhaps problems rather than answer the question.
Thank you, Joanna. A question actually for Mr. Vassilenko, directly for him, which is, as the government and president are trying to transform the political scene in Kazakhstan, which country, or is there any countries you are looking at for inspiration?
Thank you very much. Let me respond to the previous question as well about the Constitutional Court. Just as with the other laws that will be adopted, such as the law on the political parties, of course, as the saying goes, the devil will be in the details and in the implementation. So we will see how this newly re-established Constitutional Court is playing its role in protecting the Constitution and in seeking redress of any violations that our citizens will have. So in terms of the inspiration, I think I would just say that the inspiration that the president has been following is the one of desiring to make indeed his mark on the political system by opening it up. It will not happen overnight, and it will not be happening as perhaps some critics would want. But it is going on, and I think the very fact that millions of people voted and showed up, and I too, by the way, took a picture of myself by the ballot box, but I took it to show that I am proud that I have voted in this referendum. I didn't have to show to anybody. But I think this is a matter also for discussion whether or not the students were taking these photos for themselves or for reporting to somebody. Again, inspiration is the following: make life better for the people, make country more democratic, more open, make political system more competitive, make economic system more competitive, and make society more fair.
Thank you. Anybody wants to comment?
Yeah, if I may add here, sure. I just want to point out that even though maybe Tokayev is sincere about his promises, maybe he's really trying to do something, but all the methods they've been using, they're all the same. So as a person who works on the ground, as a person who talks to people, as a person who talks daily to those who were injured and tortured during the January events and all the political prisoners, and as a person who was blackmailed and a person who had a lot of pressure from our government, I see that all of those methods didn't change. And this weird way in which, you know, our government sees us, all the journalists, all the, you know, human rights defenders, all the activists, as their personal enemy, is still very disturbing. So there are no changes in this way, in any way. And I think trying to, you know, reform the country, trying to build a new Kazakhstan while using the old methods, it don't work in any way. And I think the main thing our government and our officials need to understand, that those people who are trying to, you know, who are asking for justice, who are asking for real reforms to happen, they are not the enemy of the state. They are the people who want these changes to happen for real. And one more thing I wanted to add for this comment about the committee that should return all the stolen money to Kazakhstan and all of this, you know, all of these things. I would say personally that something is really changing when I will see that Nazarbayev's personal offshores are being interrogated. Nazarbayev's personal, you know, homes and his personal estate is being sold, and all the money is back to Kazakhstan. And also Tokayev. He also, there was this very big investigation by OCCRP regarding Tokayev's money in, like, you know, this Swiss banks, in all the offshores. When this money comes back to Kazakhstan, I will personally say that something is changing. While that not happens, I won't say that. I cannot say that.
Thank you, Assem. So unfortunately, I mean, we'll have to finish very soon, but let me take a last question, which would be in a way, which would be a good way to conclude, and which is more actually for you, I mean, Joanna, Assem, and Aigerim. If you were to set out proposals for political reforms to the government, which would be the first things that you would highlight?
Okay, I can start, I guess. Well, for me, what is important is the intent of the government, and I think for now I'm not sold by this intent. But if I had a chance to start with some political reforms, I would start with the registration of on-the-ground movements, parties, because there are a lot of them in Kazakhstan. There are feminist organizations, human rights organizations, animal rights, and many of them are facing difficulties to register. Some organizations cannot get registered for years, and the Ministry of Justice doesn't even give the proper explanation why. So once we have these parties registered, there's going to be movement on the bottom of the society. There's going to be more energy and belief that something is in their hands to change. Because right now, I think the society doesn't feel that they have any power to change anything. So yeah, I would start with that.
Thank you, Joanna. Assem, do you want to add anything?
I would urge President Tokayev to be bold and let people elect their own local leaders. At some point, it'll have to happen in Kazakhstan. We've been hearing about it for 20 years. And I would think that it's time to trust people to choose who rules them and to make those local leaders accountable to the people. And that would really bring change to Kazakhstan from the ground up.
Thank you. Assem?
Yeah, I would agree with Aigerim and Joanna. The most important thing is to give people this permission to, you know, to vote for their own representatives, to give more power to the parliament. And also, as a part of a movement which is called Oyan Kazakhstan, we have all these suggestions to reform our country, including our constitution. And I would also, in the new Kazakhstan, I would want to see the officials like yourself, Mr. Vassilenko, not to hide all the wrongdoings of the government, but to say that, yes, we've been doing this, but we don't want to do this again. Like with this example that you gave us with the students, that they've been taking pictures of their ballots just to show to someone. No, they had to do it because they, even if they didn't go and vote yes, they would get, evicted. They would get evicted from their dorms, or they would get in trouble with the government. So if the government would be clear, and if they would invite the civil society to reform our country truly, that would be the first step, I think.
Thank you, Assem. I'm going to give the last word to Mr. Minister Vassilenko.
Yes, I'd like to thank Assem, Aigerim, and Joanna for a very, very passionate comments, and I agree with many of them, especially where it comes to giving people more voice and viewing the people who fight for justice as indeed allies of the government, not enemies. And indeed, this is the approach that the president and his team wants to instill in the government, and they're pushing for that. And I will be more than happy to continue this engagement with Assem and others on all of these issues. And I certainly don't think that hiding anything is possible and is needed. And in fact, people need to know everything, and people need to participate in the political life, and voting in the referendum or in any future election is one direct way of exercising your right for running the affairs of the state. So I'm thankful, I'm encouraged to hear so passionate comments and engagement from our younger generation. I'm not that old, but I see that, of course, the younger generation is more passionate and more eager for changes as soon as possible. I guess the changes are coming, and we just need to work together.
Thank you very, very much. So, I mean, as we said during this panel, I mean, this is a package of reforms. There's a lot to talk about, and for obvious reasons, we cannot address everything in an hour. I think we'll be happy at the Central Asia Program to organize, let's say, in a few months, an event to follow up and see where we are with these reforms, if and how they were implemented. So we're going to stop today. Unfortunately, I want to thank our panelists for their great presentation, for the extremely interesting discussions. I also want to thank our audience for being with us today and for the many questions and comments that they sent. And we look forward to having you again in our upcoming Central Asia Program seminars. So thank you very much again. Goodbye.
Thank you.